Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Year 9 Individuals and Societies Migration and Media Studies Instincts. So, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about media literacy and what that is. We're going to be talking about Hans Rosling's factfulness. We're going to be talking about instincts and defining them, and then we're going to go over each one. So, what is media literacy? Well, media literacy means in the middle years program that you need to be able to demonstrate an awareness that of media interpretations and events and ideas, including digital social media. Well, what does that actually mean? It means that you have to know that when you read one source, one media source, that it may look at the world differently than another media source. It may be completely different, opposite sides. And it's important to know that. It's also important to know that some represent something using facts and others represent maybe using emotion, or that there are others that actually go out to misrepresent things. It's important that you understand that. The second point here is understand the impact of media representations and modes of presentation. Well, the impact is basically, why is it important to you? Who cares? Well, it's important because as you get more and more information, particularly as you get older, but also there's more and more information available to us. And as you're getting that information, it's important that you know that this has an impact on your decision making. Say, for example, you read articles that all say that a certain area of the United States is violent. And then you have to make a choice of where you want to go to university. And you rely on that media to learn that, well, that area, that city, that place is really super dangerous. Well, so you'd end up not going there. Then you learn later that it's a perfectly safe place and that media was just telling you something that isn't actually true. That's the impact of it, is that media often affects our decisions. Okay, so how does media attempt to convince you to believe one side of an argument? So Hans Rosling, the author that we're talking about, who wrote Factfulness, suggests that there are 10 ways that we misinterpret the world around us, basically. And what he does is that he offers advice on how to not do this, on how to not interpret the world around us wrongly. It says that it's a radical new explanation of why this happens, 10 instincts that distort our perspective. So in other words, he kind of has this theory, and it's fairly simple. And what he does is that he gives us the details, says, okay, these are the 10 ways that we misinterpret, that we don't understand the world around us, that we're all the same, all of us do this. And here's some advice on how not to do that. So what we're going to do is that we're going to use that advice, and we're going to apply it to our study of media, which should be quite interesting. And he also suggests in his book that it turns out that the world is a by far better place than we tend to think it is. For example, there are far fewer poor people in the world than there used to be. Now, so let's get into the instincts now. Because we don't have time, or perhaps interest, to know all the facts, to know everything about the world, and I think it's probably impossible to do so, what we do is that we rely on these instincts to try to understand the world around us. And that can be a good thing, and it can also be a not so great thing. For example, we might overgeneralize, or we might see numbers, like a big number as a fact, something that's very scary. Anyway, whatever, let's get into it right now. Here's the first of 10. All right, well, I'm going to go through all 10 of them now, so hold on. In each one of these slides, you'll see different colors. The green is what Rosling is suggesting that you should do when considering this instinct. Then I've put a CIS example of the instinct, so it's kind of something that we can all understand. And then a migration example, because that's what we're studying. And then the blue font is what we can do to try to avoid this instinct entirely. So let's go over the first one. The first one is a gap instinct. And the green part says, try to recognize when a story talks about a gap. And remember that this paints a picture of two separate points with a gap in between. What does that mean? So here's the CIS example. Some people absolutely love Hangzhou, while other people hate it so much. In other words, it's two extremes. You either love, 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 or you hate, hate, hate. It doesn't talk about all the people in the middle that, well, they like some things and they don't like other things, as in any other normal thing. Here's a migration example. Some people want to remove all the borders and let all the criminals into our country. But we don't agree. We want our country to stay strong and protect our people against invaders. We need a wall. Okay, sound familiar? So, in other words, it's two extremes. There's the group that wants to protect us against the bad people. And there's another group of people that want to let them all in. See what I mean? But in fact, most people are somewhere in the middle. Let's look at the blue text. What can we do to avoid this instinct? So the reality is often not polarized at all. Usually the majority is right there in the middle where the gap's supposed to be. So to control this, look for that majority. Beware of a news article that just compares two extremes. You're either this or you're that, because you can be in the middle. Beware when you listen to a politician like Donald Trump, who kind of paints everything as either you're with me or you're against me. In all groups, countries or people, there are some at the top and some at the bottom. The majority is usually somewhere in between, right where that gap is. The first thing is when you're reading a news article and you see it's an us versus them, that is the gap instinct. Number two, the negativity instinct. So recognize when we get negative news and remember that information about bad events is much more likely to reach us. When things are getting better, we don't often hear about it. In other words, news tends to normally be bad. We don't read a newspaper or read a news article that is about good news, because that's not news. News is usually bad. Here's a CIS example. I heard that food at camp was terrible and that it rained. In other words, the only thing you hear about camp was what went wrong. You don't hear anything about what went right. So therefore, if you've never been to camp, you've never had that experience, you would inevitably think that it's a pretty terrible experience. Migration example. Every day, more criminals arrive at our borders, threatening the security of our country. See that? Super scary, super negative. What we can do to avoid it. To control this, expect that the news that you get is usually bad and that good news is ignored. Good news is not news. Good news is almost never reported, so news is almost always bad. When you see bad news, ask whether equally positive news would have reached you. Well, probably not. Gradual improvement is not news. When things are getting slightly better, when things are getting better, you don't often hear about it. You only hear when things are getting worse. And more news does not equal more suffering. This is interesting. More bad news is sometimes due to better understanding of suffering, not a worsening of the world. In other words, say for example you hear that there's a lot more virus in China. It doesn't in fact mean that there's a lot more virus. It means maybe that they're finding more people with the virus. But in fact, there's the same amount of virus. But yet they make it seem like this is really bad news. It's not. It's not news at all. Okay, that's the negativity instinct. The straight line instinct. Recognize the belief that a line will continue straight. And remember that such lines are rare in reality. We think that things remain the same, but actually they don't. CIS example. I got 5s in Inso in year 7 and 8. I'm terrible at Inso. In other words, just because I got it in year 7, just because I got it in year 8, I think that in year 9, and year 10, and year 11, it'll always be the same. Migrant example. Migrant caravans have been arriving at the border weekly for the past 6 months. In other words, the suggestion is that they will continue to arrive. They've always arrived and they're going to continue. We're always going to have these caravans. What can we do to avoid this instinct? To control the straight line instinct, remember that curves come in different shapes. Don't assume a straight line. Most trends do not follow a straight line, but are S-bends, slides, bumps, doubling lines. And this is an interesting thing. He says, no child has ever kept up with the rate of growth it achieved in the first 6 months. And no parents would expect it to. In other words, just because things in a news article is saying that, well, this has happened and then this happened and then that happened, the assumption is therefore it will always happen. That's not true. That is not at all the case. Things don't always follow that straight line. One of my very favorites, the fear instinct. Recognize when frightening things get our attention. And remember that these things are not necessarily the most risky. Our natural fears of violence and captivity and contamination make us systematically overestimate the risk. In other words, just because something in the news appears scary, it doesn't really mean that it's going to affect us, right? And often it's made to be more scary so that you're more affected by it. And our instinct, that fear instinct, makes us overestimate, overblow the risk. CIS example. I heard that he's a mean person and a hard marker. Well, okay. Migration example. Many illegal aliens are armed and dangerous, said local authorities. They will not hesitate to take hostages if they are at risk of capture. So very scary. Are they going to take me hostage? Well, probably not. What can we do? To control the fear instinct, calculate the risks. The world seems scarier than it is because what you hear about has been selected by the media precisely because it's scary. It doesn't mean that it's going to affect you, and it doesn't mean even that it's as scary as they're making it out to be. Risk equals danger times exposure. The risk something poses to you depends not on how scared it makes you feel, but on a combination of two things. How dangerous is it really, and how much are you exposed to it? Get calm before you carry on. When you're afraid, see the world differently. You see the world differently. Make as few decisions as possible until the panic has subsided. In other words, just because you feel fear doesn't mean you have to act on it, because the chances are that it doesn't really affect you. Next one, size instinct. Recognize when a lonely number seems impressive, something either very small or very large. And remember that you could get the opposite impression if it was compared with or divided by some other relevant number. For example, all my friends are going to boarding school. That's a CIS example. So all your friends are going to boarding school. When you hear that, you think, well, everybody's going to boarding school. But in fact, the number could be relatively small. Migration example. This year, more than 10,432 illegal immigrants have entered the country. That seems like a very large number, 10,432. But it's possible that the year before, 100,000 illegal immigrants entered the country. Therefore, 10,432 is actually quite small. Let's say, for example, at CIS, you said there was a 100% increase in suspensions in year 9. Let me say that again. In year 9, the amount of suspensions went up 100%. You would think, wow, that's really terrible. What a terrible year group. But what happens if the year before there was one suspension, now there's two? So we have 140 students in year 9. 2 of them have been suspended. The year before there was 1. Therefore, we can accurately say that the number of suspensions went up 100%. Sounds like a really big number, but in fact, it's a very, very small number of suspensions. This, ladies and gentlemen, is called the size instinct, and here's what you can do to avoid it. To control it, well, you have to get things in perspective. You have to compare. Big numbers always look big. Numbers on their own are misleading and make you suspicious. Look for a comparison. Divide. Amounts and rates can tell very different stories. Rates are more meaningful, especially when comparing different size groups. In particular, look for rates per person when comparing numbers of countries or regions. Well, what they're talking about here is that they might say, we could talk about per capita GNP or GDP per capita. So that's a number that is per person as opposed to per capita, a GDP for an entire country. In other words, when you see a very large number, compare it against something else. You read that 10,000 immigrants arrived at the border last year. It's a big number. Then you find out 100,000 the year before. Yeah? So if this fact was left out of the article, you'd think that 10,000 was huge. When compared, though, it's actually much smaller. The size instinct is something you see in many, many news articles. The generalization instinct. This is something we all do. Recognize when a category is being used in an explanation, and remember that categories can be misleading. For example, CIS, everybody hates her. Or the majority thinks he gives too much homework. This is a generalization. Migration example. We have people coming into the country or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them, but we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. Donald Trump said that. Generalization. These are animals. Imagine saying that. What can we do to avoid this instinct? To control the generalization instinct, question your categories. Look for differences within groups. Not everybody's the same. Look for similarities across groups. If you find striking similarities between different groups, consider whether the categories are relevant. Look for differences across groups. Don't assume that what applies to one group of people applies to another one. Beware when we hear the majority. Everybody thinks this way. That's probably inaccurate. And a majority means 51%. Beware of vivid examples. Vivid images are easier to recall when they might be the exception rather than the rule. So in other words, the generalization principle, or instinct I should say, is thinking that everybody thinks this way. And we see this in news articles a lot. Number 7, the destiny instinct. Recognize that many things, including people, country, religions, and cultures, appear to be constant just because the change is happening slowly. And remember that even small, slow changes gradually add up to big changes. To control the destiny instinct, remember slow change is still change. For example, CIS has always been like this. And what we're doing is that we're ignoring the changes in CIS. Migration example, the only way to keep them out is build a wall. So what can we do to avoid it? Well, we can keep track of gradual improvements. A small change each year can translate into a huge change over decades. Update your knowledge. I love this. Talk to grandpa. If you want to be reminded how values have changed, talk to your grandparents' values and see how they differ from yours. Collect examples of cultural change. So, once again, what we see here is that we think that everything remains the same, it always has. Whereas that's not true. The difference, by the way, between the straight line instinct and the destiny instinct. The straight line instinct is assuming that things have always been that way and they will be that way in the future. It's a straight line. The destiny instinct says that in the past it was like this and it's still like that. It never ever changes. I guess the difference between one is that straight line's looking into the future and the destiny one necessarily is looking at the present right now, that nothing has changed. It's always been the same way. Single perspective instinct recognizes that a single perspective can limit your imagination, and remember that it's better to look at problems from many angles to get more accurate understanding and find practical solutions. CIS example. I only like math. There's no right answer in any other subject, especially Inso. Very single perspective. Migration. The only way you're going to have border security, there's only one way. You can have all the technology in the world. I'm a professional at technology. If you don't have a steel barrier or a wall of some kind, small, powerful, you're going to have human trafficking. Okay, guess who said that? What you can do to avoid this instinct? Test your ideas. Don't collect only examples that show how excellent your favorite ideas are. This is perfect. This is what people tend to do with social media, right? Is that we only listen to our views. Limited expertise. Don't claim expertise beyond your field. Be humble about what you don't know. Be open to ideas from other fields. That is, get your information from a variety of places. Beware of simple ideas and simple solutions. History is full of visionaries who use simple visions to justify terrible actions. Welcome complexity. Love it. The blame instinct. So the blame instinct, recognize when a scapegoat is somebody that you blame for something. Say for example, your teacher gave a surprise test one day, and what you do is that you blame one of the students who reminded the teacher maybe that they didn't do a test. So it's a scapegoat. You're blaming somebody for something that happened. So recognize when a scapegoat is being used, and remember that blaming an individual often steals the focus from other possible explanations and blocks our ability to prevent similar problems in the future. Beautiful. CIS example. I only got the grade because of my teacher. So what you're doing is that you're blaming the teacher, so therefore your poor grades are a result of a scapegoat, that is, the teacher. There might be other reasons. Migration example. One of the reasons we have such high unemployment in the city of Chicago and so much crime is the massive number of illegal immigrants here that take jobs away from American citizens and Chicago citizens. Again, guess who said that? So, what we're doing is that we're blaming the problems of a city on immigrants rather than maybe the real reason, and there may be many. What can we do to control it? So, to control the blame instinct, resist finding a scapegoat. Look for causes, not villains. When something goes wrong, don't look to an individual or group to blame. Accept that sometimes bad things can happen and there isn't anybody to blame. Instead of blaming one person or a group, try to understand the multiple reasons that created that situation. There's lots and lots of them, maybe. Finally, number 10, the urgency instinct. Recognize when a decision feels urgent and remember that it rarely is. Here's a CIS example. The site says the sale is only on for 5 minutes. I have to buy it now. Perhaps some of you have been shopping online, shopping for shoes perhaps. And what you see is a little sign that comes up and it says that this particular shoe is only on sale for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and you have to buy it now. After that, the price is going to double. So you go, what? So what you do is that you go and run, you get a credit card from who knows who, you put it in there, and now you own these shoes. And it has this feeling that I have to do this now. It's super urgent. Here's a migration example. Our country is facing an urgent crisis as illegal aliens stream across our border, including a caravan of thousands heading here at this moment. You feel that urgency. Something needs to be done now. Okay? What can we do to control this? First of all, take a breath. Next, insist on data. Is this really true? Next, beware of fortune tellers. Any prediction of the future is uncertain. Be aware of predictions that fail to acknowledge that. Beware of drastic action. Don't buy those shoes. Take a day. Sleep on it. Think about it. Chances are the price will go down again. Do you really need more shoes? Probably not. Ask what the side effects will be. Ask how the idea has been tested, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the 10 instincts. It's a lot. These instincts, what you'll be doing is that you'll be reading news articles and you'll be looking for examples of the instincts. So you have to know each of the 10 and you have to understand how they might be included in a news article. Here's a summary, ladies and gentlemen. So, in this case, you have the instincts and the rules of thumb. So, rule of thumb, the instinct is sort of what you tend to do, like generalize or have that urgency or have that straight line. You'll see that, and then the rules of thumb are ways that we can get away from this, that we don't really need to do this. So the first one, ladies and gentlemen, is the gap instinct. And the question is there really a gap? Go for the blue stones. If you read a news article that's saying that it's an us versus them thing, these people think this way, we think this way, that's an example of the gap instinct. And what we need to do is that we need to look at the majority. Blue stones, if you like. Next one, the negativity instinct. Remember that news tends to be negative, and we think, oh, everything's getting worse. You know, we see this with climate change, of course. Well, maybe it is getting worse, but we see it with climate change for sure. At the moment, we have the coronavirus, and the news that we get is always this sort of bad news. Ask yourself, would good news get any attention? It's not that there isn't good news. It's just that all we hear is bad. Again, if you're reading a news article, look for examples of that. The straight line instinct, it just continues. Everything always continues. Well, why would it continue? Wouldn't it bend? Wouldn't it change? Don't things change sometimes? Assume that things are not always in a straight line. It's scary. This is the fear instinct. Beautiful. So news articles are always doing that, right? They're always trying to scare us. Is it really dangerous? Calculate the risk. In other words, think, is it really, really that scary to you? I mean, no doubt it is scary and it's negative and it's bad, but is it going to affect you? Probably not. A size instinct. Is it big by comparison? Love that. Take a look at those two elephants. So when we see the small one, we think, wow, that's a big elephant, until we see the average size of elephants. We kind of go, okay, maybe it's not that big. News articles are always doing that. The generalization, everybody's always the same. We all think this way. Question your categories. Do we really think that way? Is it? Aren't there differences? Apples and oranges. Look for the differences between people. Okay. Destiny instinct. Things never change. Isn't it always changing slowly? There are things that in fact change. It's just that you don't see the change. Some people say CIS has always been the same school. But for some of us who've been at CIS for a long time, we know it's actually quite a different place. Seems like it never changes, but actually it does. Single perspective, only one way of looking at things. But there are multiple ways. In Inso, there are always multiple ways of looking at things. And when you read a news article and it suggests to you there's only one way of looking at this issue, ask yourself, is it really? Probably not. That's a single perspective instinct. The blame instinct, look at that. That's the bad guy. That's the scapegoat. So resist doing this, because there's probably many other reasons why something goes wrong. And if you just blame one group or one person, then you'll never really know the real causes why something goes wrong. Let's say you have an article that's blaming immigrants for crime. Ask yourself, do immigrants really cause crime? The answer is probably no. So what does cause crime? Well, you're going to find maybe it's poverty or racism or unemployment. There's lots of reasons for crime. If we only blame immigrants, then we wouldn't solve the real problems. And finally, the urgency. These are the shoes that you have to buy right now. Ask yourself, do we really need to think this way? So in a news article, it might say there are illegal immigrants arriving at the border. There's going to be 100,000 of them tomorrow. As you read it, you go, oh no, 100,000 tomorrow, we need to do something. This is the urgency instinct. Now, don't get confused. It's possible that one thing could be more than one instinct. For example, if you read in a newspaper or in a news article that there's 100,000 migrants and there are 100,000 violent migrants arriving tomorrow. Well, you've got the size instinct because of the 100,000, right? You've got the urgency instinct because it's happening tomorrow. What else you have? I don't know. You've got the negativity instinct. And the size instinct, and the fear, right? The fear instinct. It's possible to have more. Ladies and gentlemen, here's what you need to do. What you've done is that you've been listening to me for a long time. You need to read the article on instincts that is no doubt linked somewhere easily for you to find, but it's also on our website. And then there's a handout that you need to do. And then you need to practice by reading a news article and finding examples of these instincts. Thank you very much for your attention.